Excuse me. Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Caden Proctor and how he really regrets the decisions he made in the transfer portal over the offseason, how it's likely a huge thing for the future of the transfer portal, and making sure this is dies down just a little bit. So definitely huge news there, but let's get into some playoff Cinderellas and how I'm not necessarily sure they'll look the way that you want them to look. I do think that we'll get some Cinderella-like teams in the 12-team playoff. I'm just not sure they're going to be group of 5 teams. So let's start to break this down and get into what exactly I mean here. So when we talk about Cinderellas in the 12-team playoff, we always like to lean to the group of 5 teams, and for good reason. There's a lot of really incredible group of 5 teams, and that would be one of the craziest stories that we have seen in quite some time. If a group of 5 team was able to get to the 12-team playoff, maybe win a couple of games, make their run to the semifinals or maybe the national championship, and do something remarkable. I don't think that's necessarily possible, and no disrespect to those group of 5 teams, there's plenty of really, really good ones around the country, but when you look at group of 5 teams right now, the ceiling that I have for pretty much everyone across the board is you can win a first round game. There is an ability to possibly steal a first round game from a Power 5 team. Now, is it going to be easy? Absolutely not, because the majority of these group of 5 teams, actually I would bet all of them for the foreseeable future, will have to go to another team's stadium to play that opening round game, and winning that game is going to be incredibly tough, but the reality is I do think that is possible. I just think that might be the ceiling for what they can do. I think when you talk about their really incredible players at the group of 5 level, Caden Salter at Liberty, Mario Williams transferred from USC to Tulane, a ton of players down at that level. Ricky White is a fantastic receiver over at UNLV. So there's so many really, really good players at the group of 5 level. The issue is that's not necessarily what makes a championship team. Now, you need those players, don't get me wrong, but the thing you need more than anything else is depth. You need people that can play, 2, 3, maybe even 4 deep in some of these games to win what looks like to be 17 games to win a national title if you're a group of 5 team, 16 to get, into the final or semifinal and figure it out from there. But the reality is these teams are going to have to go undefeated to get in the first place, because I would be very surprised if there were no group of 5 teams that were undefeated. So I think that's going to happen. And then you got to go to someone else's building. You got to beat them there. And then you got to play probably one of the best teams in the country, maybe an SEC or a Big Ten champion, and figure it out from there. So it's one of those things where when we look at the group of 5 teams, there's a lot of really, really good ones. There's just not ones that have, third line guys that can play with Georgia's third line guys or Oregon's third line guys, and you don't have necessarily the ability to go as deep as you would like. And with a possible 17 game schedule ahead of you, you're going to need as many guys, as many bodies as possible, and it's just more of an ability for those bigger teams to do that. So I'd love to sit here and tell you that a group of 5 team is going to make a remarkable run, and I'm not necessarily saying it can't happen, but realistically, I don't necessarily see it in the cards. I think one of the teams that I'm watching a little bit closer is Liberty with Caden Salter, because he is one of the most electric players, electric quarterbacks in the entire country. So if there was someone that could totally tip the scales and change the way that we look at the 12-team playoff in the group of 5, it might just be that guy. But that is also something that I think is a little bit unlikely. But that doesn't mean we're not going to get Cinderellas. I do think there is going to be plenty of teams that have a couple of losses on their schedule and then find their way into the playoff and make a little bit of a run. And I think that team right there, LSU, would be a fantastic example. When you look at the SEC and the Big Ten today, there's going to be teams that lose 3 games that find their way into the playoff. And frankly, I think there should be, because when you look at those schedules comparative to the ACC or the Big 12 schedules, it's a lot harder. Let's just be totally honest with you. And I think when you look at, say, a 9-3 LSU team or a 9-3 Ole Miss team or one of those type of teams, if they roll in at 11 or 12, they're a little bit more adept to go on the road and play at, Penn State or play at Oregon or play at Texas, whatever that looks like. they're a little bit more adept to do that because they have a lot of bodies behind them. Now, this LSU team I'm a little bit worried about because the defensive side of the ball is none too good, but just in general, they're an example of a team that absolutely could do something. Penn State is another great example of a team that can make some noise in this scenario where maybe you go 10-2, maybe you do the classic Penn State season, but you still find your way into the party, and maybe one of these teams has suffered an injury in the early parts of the year, and he finally found his way back onto the field, and that's a huge piece for them going forward. So there's a lot of different ways that this can unfold. There's a lot of different, paths for Cinderellas to pop up. It just won't be, JMU or App State or Troy. It will be, LSU or Ole Miss or Penn State or one of these teams that definitely has that depth, has that physicality, has all of the things that you really need to make a run in this playoff, because it's going to be really hard to win 17 games. Now, some of these big-time teams likely won't have to do that to win a national title, but the group of five will absolutely have to do that. And I just don't see how that's physically possible, frankly, looking at all of these rosters. But the reality is I do think we're going to get a very, very cool run. I do think we're going to get, a team that we didn't to get in maybe in week 6 or in week 7 to really heat up towards the end of the season and find their way in at an 11 or 12 seed and then really make a run. I think that is definitely something that could be on the table, whether it's a 3-loss team or maybe it's just a 2-loss team that was just right on the outside of a Big 10 or SEC or Big 12 championship. So there's a lot of really, really cool storylines. There's no two ways about that. And I think having the group of 5 in on this playoff is a really fun thing. The reality is they're just not really playing the same sport. So I fully expect, a lot of these group of 5 teams to have to go to Austin, Texas, or Eugene, Oregon, or, Happy Valley, and play some of these teams and just get railroaded. And it's not necessarily to say it's not an honor to get there and they haven't had an incredible season, but I would just say if you're expecting, a Tulane or a App State or one of these smaller teams to make a deep run in the playoff, I wouldn't hold your breath. No disrespect to those two teams, but it's going to be really, really tough for them to get there. Now, one of the very interesting things that I'm going to be watching in terms of variability and in terms of upsets is what happens when, let's say, the SEC championship loser. So let's just Texas loses to Georgia in the SEC championship this upcoming year, and they're the 5 seed. And they get a 12 seed that is, let's say, Miami or Kansas State or Kansas, one of the teams that might be a little bit on the lower side of the ACC or the Big 12, but found their way in because they had a good schedule. Maybe they lost in their conference championship, whatever that looks like. Those are the teams that I'm really interested in, because we all know over the past couple of years, a lot of energy has been pushed towards the SEC and the Big 10, with the Big 12 and the ACC kind of falling off just a little bit and people not caring about them as much, not talking about them as much. And I would be shocked if those players weren't a little bit angry about that. I would be shocked if they didn't have a little bit extra motivation to make something happen this upcoming year against those teams for that reason. So I think when we get into the playoff and maybe you have a, Oregon against Miami or Arizona against Bama or one of these really, really interesting games where it is an ACC team, it is a Big 12 team against an SEC or a Big 10 team, there's going to be a lot of talk that the Big 10 or the SEC team is going to just roll on through. They're going to find their way to the second round because that team is coming to your house. They're a Big 10 or ACC team. They're not necessarily to be worried about. They're going to have to be worried about. I promise you that. Those teams are going to come with as much energy as possible. They are going to want to make a statement, and I think if we're talking about motivation to make a run in the playoff, very few schools in the country have as much motivation as those Big 12 and ACC schools, because they want to prove everyone wrong. They want to show that the new playoff agreement that they signed is not indicative of how the conferences actually work and how the conferences stack up to each other, and this would be the perfect way to make that statement. Now, do I necessarily expect some of those teams to pull that off? I don't know. I think it'll be very much up in the air, but I do know that Arizona has a better chance of going to Eugene, Oregon and getting a win than Georgia State does, or James Madison does, or one of these type of teams. So I think if we see a Cinderella, quote unquote, if we see one of those teams that kind of pop up and we don't expect them, it'll be one of those type of teams. It'll be, maybe a Big 12 or ACC teams that barely missed or barely lost their conference title and are very upset and have tons of motivation coming in. Or maybe it is an LSU or a Penn State that lost a couple of games but played a really tough schedule, maybe got healthy towards the end of the year, and then made a run in the 12-team playoff. So it will create chaos. I can promise you that. The 12-team playoff is going to be one of the weirder, one of the crazier things that we have seen in college football, because I think it is going to create variability. I think there is going to be upsets. I think there will be some Cinderellas down the road. I just don't think they're going to be group of 5 teams. And I don't necessarily think that takes away too much from the Cinderella, because I think the story is incredible regardless. But I do understand why some fans would be looking at, LSU or Penn State or one of these big time teams making their way on a run and saying, this is not necessarily what I wanted. And it's not necessarily what I want either. I'd love to see a group of 5 team make a deep run in this playoff. But when I look at it at face value, it's just they don't necessarily have the things that you need to make a run, especially in a game where you're going to have to play a very physical team one week at their home and then go on the road and play another really physical team. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. Hopefully a group of 5 team proves me wrong and shuts me up on this. But from where I'm standing, I think you're more likely to see the Cinderella of LSU or Ole Miss than you are of Tulane or App State. So that'll be really interesting to watch, but we're going to take our third break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about an all-transfer portal team. We're going to go to the defensive side of the ball this time around. We did offense yesterday, but tons of really good defensive players. And we'll break down who I think might just make that first team, all-transfer team right after this. So stick with us.